So I want to start by saying that you should not trust what I have to say. I've been moving between multiple universities and I have not been deeply embedded in student struggles, which have often been led by young black women. So I'm not the right person for this job. Still, I have some tentative thoughts about our student movements which I hope are useful for you. So a common narrative is that it started in 2015, like you saw in that video, at the University of Cape Town actually, where students called for decolonizing the intellectual climate of the university. An important symbol of this was the statue of Rhodes. And you saw that manifested then in England at Oxford, for instance, where they were calling for Rhodes to fall at Oxford. At Wits University then in Johannesburg, they expanded these demands and called for workers to be insourced, so no longer to be outsourced or casualized, but to be permanent staff. And this quickly moved to other universities, and the demand for free education became the rallying cry in September. So these must fall. Students at some universities have also protested for an end to our culture of rape and homophobia. Recently in Johannesburg, just this last weekend, they started moving beyond the confines of the university to work together with their families, neighbors, mosques, and churches. This weekend, for the first time that I know of, they marched with people outside of the university, with community elders. They had to bust in the elders who were in their wheelchairs, and with trade unions, musicians, women's savings groups, and concerned parents. So I think student movements have been pushing the conceptual limits of what it means to decolonize education. It's not only about changing the race and gender profile of our academic staff and intellectual canons. It includes the idea of universities as a public good, where workers are valued and respected, where education is a right rather than a privilege that you buy, and where the university belongs to everyone. Because their work is about expanding our imaginations, I think it's also fair to probe the limits of their work. So to do so, I want to reflect on three moments. And these were three experiences that I had. The first moment. Students at Fort Hare, a historically black university, have been protesting against the university withholding student funding. It is April, so the university starts in February, it's now April, and they have yet to be paid. Many are the first in their community to go to university, and they use their student funding not only to buy food for themselves, but to send money home so their families can eat. Every year, student funds are delayed, and there are mass protests at the university. But this year, the university has actually taken the student funds and used it to pay salaries instead. There are no more student funds. Students' protests are met by extreme violence. Police rolling down the streets in tanks armed with semi-automatic rifles and live ammunition. The media are absent, and the middle class is indifferent. When students at the historically white university Rhodes are asked to show solidarity with Fort Hare, some respond by saying, Rhodes is still the colony, whereas Fort Hare is in the post-colony. Our struggles are different. They refuse to act. The second moment. 50 students at CPUT are arrested. We have 6 hours to find 150,000 rand in bail, otherwise they will be sent to the maximum security prison, Horswood, notorious for institutionalized rape and torture. But students at CPUT mostly come from working class and rural families. They do not have this money, and the media is not interested in covering this outrage. A call is put out to elite universities. Wits students in Johannesburg have a solidarity fund for financing food and transport to their protests, and they have some additional funds left. Can they donate something? Or can they maybe add their voices to a petition? Their response? Good luck. The third moment. Rhodes has invited postgrad students from all 4 universities in the Eastern Cape, which is a province in South Africa, to talk about what decolonization means and to build working relationships between students at the 4 universities. Those from Walter Sisulu University are older than most. They are lecturers who are doing their PhDs in order to upgrade their qualifications. Their university is more vocational than research-oriented and serves young black people in some of the most remote areas of the country. So they offer a really important perspective, but none of us get a chance to hear it. They are casually talked over by younger, wealthier compatriots at elite universities who speak very nasal English. The students flee the two-day conference after just one morning. No one seems to notice their absence. These moments suggest to me that students are finding it difficult to forge strong and equal relationships between universities that are elite and historically white and universities that are black and working class. And I worry this is in part because of a limited social imagination. This imagination appears to rest on a hierarchy of value. White lives are more important than black lives, and black lives in elite spaces are more important than black lives in working class and rural spaces. For example, the film that we just saw, all of the footage was from historically white universities. There was not a single piece of footage from a historically black or working class university. So it seems to me that our understanding of the right to intellectual labor is similarly narrow. Students have often been engaged in very rich intellectual work, as I think that film shows, as both academic and public intellectuals. But the students whose voices are heard are those from elite universities. And this strikes me as a great pity, because I suspect that some of the most important intellectuals of our generation are being forged in the struggles of black working class universities. I say this because of the history of student activism in black universities, which has been critical to opening up the social imagination. So BCO, for example, is a key thing in that regard. In building the living archive of struggle, there is a need to center and pay careful attention to the intellectual work of students of black working class universities, I think. To do otherwise is to impoverish and distort our social imagination. It is to rob ourselves of people and institutions that are vital to reconfiguring our society.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to shed some thoughts on the education crisis in South African higher education. I'd like to talk in the discussion about my role in the facilitation process around creating something for students to find mechanisms to resolve the crisis. But I want to start where I think Nimi has left off, and that is about how do you understand the student crisis in much more societal terms. And I'll start to say that for me, the South African higher education system is in a systemic crisis. That the essential access point of this crisis is the defunding of the higher education system by the South African government and the concomitant growth of enrollments in higher education. Specifically, it's been the government's subsidy to universities has decreased from 50% in 1994, the year of our democracy, to 40% in 2014. In that same period, between 1994 up until this year, 2019, student enrollments have increased from 500,000 students to 1 million students. So you see that reflects a systemic crisis to some degree. So the consequences of this defunding of higher education by a state is the erosion of the academic project in South Africa. The crippling, in other words, of the ability of academic institutions to provide quality, transformative higher education to students and to produce scholarship of merits and which can contribute to wider social change in our society. The crisis in higher education is now a collective threat. It is experienced by not only students but also workers, academics and administrators at higher education institutions. It is this systemic crisis, the political economy of higher education, that I believe the mobilization by students around the demand for free education needs to be located. So this is my starting point, the political economy of the higher education system. So I want to make a series of observations about the larger political and educational meaning of this crisis in my position as a scholar of social policy, whose own university is embroiled in the crisis and who has been directly involved in attempts to resolve the crisis. My initial comments are focused on the students and their demands, and the discussion I hope to engage the responses of academics, workers and administrators. As Nimi has indicated, the student demands are composed of a composite: free facilitated access to those who cannot afford higher education, with demands to quote-unquote decolonize university education and to improve the provision of support services. Support service workers at South African universities are almost exclusively poor and black. The student mobilization as articulated in these demands are to be applauded in my view. It represents a paradigm shift from a neoliberal, stigmatizing, ameliorative agenda of poverty alleviation, which has characterized social policy in post-apartheid South Africa, to a new societal agenda focused on the universalization of the public good. While the debate has been focused on the affordability of free education, the real debate, in my view, is the idea of the good society that the students' demands represent. The demand for free education, although never claimed as such, is an unambiguous social democratic idea. The idea, in other words, that the state should provide and guarantee all citizens equal access to public goods such as education and health, and of the same quality as an entitlement of their social citizenship, and not subject to the vagaries of the market. Students at my university, Rhodes University, a small historically white university modeled on an English liberal university, reject the idea that they have to quote-unquote perform their poverty through means testing. In this, there are echoes that wonderful writer of social policy, Richard Titmuss, who has written eloquently about the stigmatizing, socially alienating role of means testing, and that, to quote Titmuss, services for the poor end up being poor services. Free education is, however, as articulated in the student demands, a social democratic idea, but without a social democratic program. While students articulate ideas about quote-unquote decolonization, by which they mean an affirmation of black history and thought in the academic project, it is cast backwards to an historical ideal of Africanism and Pan-Africanism, and cohered largely around the thinking of the Algerian revolutionary Frantz Fanon. This needs further problematization, in my view. Is the welcome embrace of African intellectual thought and Africanism not reconcilable with the perpetuation of racial capitalism in South Africa? This is asked as a question. What is the real challenge to the social order represented by free education, which gains poor students access, but which leaves unchanged the social hierarchies they will occupy when they exit with degrees, which entitles them with to lives of comparative privilege? If fees must fall, surely degrees must also fall, and new methods of codifying knowledge examined, if radical social change is to be contemplated in a thoroughgoing decolonization. What then is the theory of social movements that underpins the student agenda? They are tenaciously a multi-class movement and provocatively call for free education for all, regardless of their class position. This again is a classic social democratic proposition. The response from a range of commentators from both the left and the right is to question the absurdity of the students struggling for the children of millionaires to also benefit from free education. This response, in my view, fails completely to appreciate that students are not cohering around classic class position politics. They are embracing a new kind of politics and political identification that recognizes but does not privilege class. In this, they are again breaking from an ameliorative politics that has underpinned South African social policy and which has reinforced the inequality of South Africa's racialized capitalism. In other words, they are rejecting the very notion of the poor, quote-unquote, as a stable conceptual category in explaining their collective condition as mobilized students. They want to transition from being, quote-unquote, poor to being emancipated. And such emancipation is found in the embrace of an Africanist identity that is primarily, but not exclusively, ideational. In this lies the danger, perhaps. The danger of capture with demagogic populist politics that is present in the political ferment of South Africa as constitutional politics fails in favor of factionalist patronage politics, exhibited perhaps most glaringly in that of the President Jacob Zuma. Perhaps understandably, but also worryingly for myself as a past anti-apartheid activist and a communist, and now a latter-day reconstructed social democrat, the students reject the quote-unquote Mandela narrative of our political emancipation. Everything is subject to scrutiny, and my generation is now seen as part of the problem. They are correct to ask these strategic questions, but these the danger equally of an ahistorical narrative emerging to replace the fading narrative of our path to democracy, the rainbow path to democracy. There is an unbinding of the collective narrative of South Africa's quote-unquote miracle path to non-violent democracy. The students are in angry revolt from the failed politics of our immediate democratic past, but towards what is not certain yet. These are both times of intellectual hope and challenge, but also times of potential danger. Thanks.
Thanks. Okay. They the insiders. I guess I'm partly insider, partly outsider. What I'm going to pick up on some of the themes. I mean, I think both Nimi and Robbie agree that Fees Must Fall is a significant political moment and movement. But I think the point we need to understand is it's been a long time in the coming. And there have been other but less reported protests, such as township municipal protests. Municipal IQ estimated that in the first 4 months of 2016, there were 70 service delivery protests. That averages out to 1 every second day. And similar data in 2015 and 2013, the period there, counted 3 protests of all kinds, not just service delivery and labour strikes. So I think the vociferous in this debate get heard. But I think the point I want to make is there's a deeper and more sustained malaise in the South African context. And therefore the student protests are part of greater sense of citizen dissatisfaction about service delivery in a context of deep unemployment, which in fact has gone up in the latest count, inequality, and a historic legacy which has been glossed over by the rainbow nation idea. I'm not going to talk about the reasons for the protest or the forms it's taken. We can come up to it. But I think there are 2 things, just to echo what Robbie and Nimi said. First is the chronic underfunding of higher education. South Africa spends 0.74% of GDP on higher education, in a context where it expects student numbers to increase to 1.6 million by 2013 from a base of about 300,000 in about 1994. So that's, you can work out the maths yourself. Yet at the same time, and this is important, and this maybe the Vice Chancellor of Sussex might like to hear, South African universities get their 55% of their revenue from students and private income. Only 38% come from government sources. And this has, the current figure, in fact, as Robbie said, it dropped dramatically to 40% in 2013 and 38% in 2016. So, and this is a real-term decrease in government subsidy to higher education. In that context, it's clear that students should be angry. So should academics, so should their administrators. But the flip side of this is the student debt has increased. It's not that universities just are underfunded, but the student debt increased in a 2-year period from 2.6 billion to 3.4 billion. That's 31% over 2 years. Students are really struggling. So what I want to talk about is give an academic perspective in the sense of how do academics in the current context analyze this protest and what are their voices? What are the explanations they're giving for the things they are seeing? So it's a counterpoint, I guess, to that. The first point that's important here is, Robbie alluded to it, is whose struggle is this? Is this a struggle of students? Is this a struggle of workers? Is this a struggle of academics? Is it all? And is it a generational struggle? Because part of the argument here has been that the older generation of activists have served their time. They're no longer appropriate or relevant to the contemporary political struggles of the young people we saw there. And clearly there's a generational gap. I'll just read you out some things that some academics say about the protest, and then I'll try to analyze it. Politics department at UCT says, Blade's intervention in the student crisis with the Minister of Higher Education is the most useless that I've ever seen in years to come. And then, by contrast, another person said, I think it is helpful for the university to throw the responsibility back to the education ministry. Whereas Mbembe says he's worried about the strategies of both the students and about the universities, because if they shut it down, and they shut it down totally as advocated, you're creating the situation of how African universities declined in the 80s and 70s. So, and he also talks, and I'll come back to it, he says there's a dangerous radical equivalence of all opinions counting in the debate. And he goes on to about it. Jane Duncan, by contrast, says is that what we're seeing is a university that is out of touch, and university staff members are unrealistic, but I don't believe they are. Rather, leaving society the way that it is what is unrealistic. When struggles over how societies are organized becomes generalized, then suddenly what appeared unrealistic a while ago becomes realistic as people are forced to think outside of their narrow, often self-imposed boxes. That's a diversity of views, because it would be fair to summarize that by saying there isn't a single voice of academics that emerged, maybe perhaps of students. Now, so what are the explanations academics give about this protest? There are several that I think I come across. One is that the students' fee protest is a good idea, but it's badly targeted. This isn't about universities. This is fundamentally must be directed to government. The university is not able to deliver on free higher education because as a public institution it's reliant on government funding. And if government funding declines, then universities are unable to meet the demand. So for academics such as this, the real target for such academics is the government. And they feel that students misunderstood the nature of the crisis. That links to the second argument that academics often give, that we agree with the sentiment and the moral statements of the students, but not the means. In other words, Adam Habib talks about right goals, wrong means, becomes the common refrain. This is constituted either in terms of the violence that stalks the protest, or in terms of the lack of alliance, something which Nimi speaks about. The third one, which is more policy wonkish, I guess, is that students are just, and those arguing for fee-free higher education are being policy naive, because free higher education is not possible, nor desirable, nor feasible in South Africa or in any other country in the world. Somebody has to pay for it, so the argument goes, and it seems just right that the rich should pay a little bit more for higher education. So if the rich go into universities, then you should charge them more. To exempt them from not paying fees under the banner of fee-free higher education is problematic. And there's a strong progressive argument to that, in that if you want equity in society, you must make the rich pay a lot more than the poor. But fundamentally, there's also another explanation which nobody talks about. It's about efficiency, and it's about quality in higher education, which is the simple reality. The higher education burden increases because an average student does not complete their degree in 3 years, but takes between 5 to 6 years. Right? So that's a doubling of in economic terms, the unit cost. And the group that carries that burden the most are the poor, working class, and marginalized students. So clearly universities are not, that's where the blame lies at the door of the university. It's the efficiency and the quality they provide. Then there's also an explanation, and I'll run through some of these more quickly, that all this is about just more and more neoliberalism coming to the fore. Thus, academics see this as the macro-fiscally conservative policies of governments in a time of shrinking social sector provision. Patrick Bourne in his article talks about fossilized capitalism being at the root of the student protest, and then goes on to explain how you deal with it. This discourse about the state being to blame and the macroeconomic environment feeds into a broader idea, which some feed into the idea that what is being witnessed in South Africa is higher education is becoming the site of contestation for state power. It's a space people are using to contest the space. And it's the space that students and other forces are using in order to transform state power. And that's an important argument. But from the state's point of view, they then talk about third forces and conspiracies theories into the protest. Then what you're seeing is those red shirts, which are party political members of the EFF, non-students, going into the protest. So it becomes the last idea, which I think is important, that what you're witnessing is the politics of anger. And this is used by academics to dismiss the student protest. This is simply the politics of people who are really angry in the street. They've always been angry about symbols. They've been angry about Rhodes symbols. They've been angry about money. But what they don't understand, that anger is important, but it's beyond anger. The protests are fundamentally a little bit more than the politics of anger. And I think in this, what gets wrapped up is the idea of decolonization, and I think we must come to it. We need to argue, as Robbie says, what it is, how it can be taken up, and how it can be realized is the subject of much debate. And it's interesting, the big debate in Sussex and any other universities, what does decolonization mean? The Students' Union, I was reading one of the manifestos of the Students' Union in the Badger some time back, talked about a conference on decolonization in February in Sussex. What does that actually mean in practice? What is the frame of decolonizations? Now, it ranged from the most well-known example of scratching Newtonian science from the physics chemistry to the idea of replacing names and writers and speakers. But it's a lot, and it occurs in the context of being wrapped up in arguments about gender equity as well. Now, just a small insight, Nimi and I looked at IT curricula in various universities in South Africa. What struck us was the absence of discussions of Africa and the absence of any scholars who, if you like, come from Africa or represent Africa.
Outside of South Africa.
Outside of South Africa. But yet Mbembe is very critical about this notion of decolonizations, and we must come back to it. So what do I make of these academic debates? How do I see these 5 or 6 explanations? First, I think all these explanations are at best partial. They reflect as much the positioning of academics and their ideological proclivities as they offer an understanding of how to analyze the protest. They often shed more heat than light. And I think the rawness of the events in South Africa befuddles serious, engaged analysis of the point. It can't be anything but that. But these explanations are all partial. Part of it is neoliberalism. Part of it's maybe about the politics of anger, but there are lots more going on. Secondly, what I find striking in this whole debate, and this is my swan song of the last, or my song of the last 20 years, the real silence is about funding education in general. I have often spoken about the inequities in school funding through the fee charging model. In fact, South Africa had fee charging, and it starts at the school level, not at the higher education level. Yet this has hardly been raised in the student protests. It is ironic that at some institutions, some of the students in the protests about calling for fee charging come from the very fee charging schools that enable them to access elite fee charging universities. I think we need to tackle that. There's been no protest, no discussion, and a third of all South African learners in schools are in these elite fee charging schools. We need to talk about this. We need to talk about equity more generally. Third, I think worrisome is the fact that there's no real engagement with the discussion of strategies and tactics. It is often too easily glossed over that the movement is leaderless, that violence a la a particular reading of Fanon is what disrupts power, that the state should pay, and that what Habib calls the maximalist agenda should prevail. Right? But these are issues that get glossed over in the debate, and we must talk about that. I think worrisome is also outsourcing, which was a key issue in the student protest movement, comes in but gets lost often. And therefore, to sustain the struggle and to build alliances with the workers is crucial. Yet there are obvious knock-on effects, as Nimi pointed out. If you insource, right, academics are going to have to take a salary cut in South Africa. There are limits, right? You can increase the cake, but there's going to be hard choices that have to be made. And when universities use the NISFAs, the student funds, to pay the salaries, it's an indication that the university is not financially able to sustain its activity. So insourcing, and that's why the demand for insourcing comes. I've got a bit more, but I won't talk about it now. I think what we need to talk about, and I've got some suggestions about, I think we need to understand from the academic perspectives that explain these protests, but we need to think about there are 3 different levels of struggle within the student movement as fees must fall. There's firstly a struggle about fees and funding. There's struggles about decolonisation, and there's struggles about workers' rights on campus. But all must be cohered in an idea of education as a public good. Hopefully in the discussion I can pull out a bit more about the kinds of recommendations.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that was a nice introduction and nice different perspective.
I wanted to pick up firstly on this idea of Hoffmann in student struggles. What I find really remarkable is the complete absence of any other African scholars of higher education in the discussions, right? So scholars who have written deeply about what it means to be engaged in African intellectual activity, about the history of African universities and about their role in society are completely absent from the discussion. And there seems to be a kind of a resistance to engaging with that scholarship. And maybe that is itself reflective of the lacuna in South African higher education. But what it means is that because people don't have a historical understanding of African universities in general, they start to think about South African universities as these very it's a rare case, right? So they don't think about how actually we are African, we are on the African continent, and our universities are following the similar kinds of trajectories to other African universities, and we have much to learn from student struggles across the continent. And I think what that means is that we make strategic errors. So for example, Dani writes a lot about how students' political activism to defend their universities during structural adjustment never managed to spill out beyond the campus and to connect with trade unions, to connect with market women's associations, to connect with farmers associations. And because of that, society as a whole didn't have a stake in maintaining the universities. And so the students and the academics ultimately failed to protect their universities, and universities across the continent declined rapidly. And so so in the South African context, it strikes me that we are in danger of doing the same thing. That was the one thought. And then the second thought is, and I suppose it's linked to this, is a systemic understanding of higher education as linked to basic education, as a system as a whole. So you're right, there hasn't been a discussion about fee charging schools. And that's because a lot of the struggles are isolated within the university. So you're starting to see a little bit, maybe it's splitting out into the schools a little bit, like some school students are starting to join up with the university students. But I've been at student meetings where you raise this issue, where you say, but hold on, schools also charge fees. Shouldn't we be cohering these struggles, right? And right now it seems like people are so much focused on the demons of the university. They feel like the university administration is out to get them and is the enemy. And so they're very, very localized struggles. And so they're not yet thinking about the systemic issues.
Robbie?
2 observations. I really like Yusuf's observation. His observations. But the one thing I would question is whether this is contesting state power. My own sense is it's an attempt to reconcile very sectional demands, that's sectional demands of the students, within the context of how government is exercising its power. So it's about government needing to deliver on this demand, but I don't think it's necessarily going to result in a more thoroughgoing transformation of state power. Once that demand is acceded to, my real sense is that there will be a diminishing and a decline of the student politics and the student momentum. So that's just the one thing about how the student in terms of the students' movement and how it's configured as a social movement is engaging with the state. The other thing is, I think strategy and tactics, absolutely. And strategy and tactics includes alliances within the university context. What's striking for me is that the students do not exploit differences within the administrative and staff body to create an alliance that consolidates certain limited gains, albeit necessary gains, in terms of organizational space, etc., and to use that as the basis for further rupture. It seems it is about some sort of maximalist set of demand, which obviously then polarizes forces for and against, either for us fully or you against us. And that's something quite striking in how the strategy and tactics have emerged. And I think it has diminished the possibility of scholars, progressive scholars and administrators coming in more meaningfully around precisely the demand that I think Yusuf alludes to, which is the fact that the problem is about the state's defunding of higher education. And so in my own context, what we felt was important was to shift the agenda, to say to the students, we need to engage in a dialogue. And part of the dialogue is to say that if you shut down the university, as you saw one of the students in the video was discussing the notion of a shutdown, it means that workers who live in a poor township, which is adjoining our university, which is a rural university in a reasonably affluent area called Grahamstown, it means they will lose their jobs. So there's a direct class interest on the part of workers to retain university as open institutions. Whereas the students' demand is, if you're not going to access to free education, you're shutting it down. And for me, that reflects, if I must return to a certain kind of class politics, that reflects a very narrow petty bourgeois political consciousness. Because these are, in a sense, mainly middle-class students and poor students who have the access and the privilege of entering the university space, which means they had some level of a better-off education than the most impoverished of black working-class and poor students. And there needs to be far more reflection on their part about their class positionality. And I understand, and I find this provocative, how they're reconfiguring the class politics. It's an intellectual challenge that must be engaged with. But within that, it can't be used as a fiat to push in a class project that actually is not about social liberation, that does not meaningfully deal with the interests of the working class. Precisely in the way that Yusuf describes, of saying, absolutely, you picked up on the demand of the ending of privatization of support services, and then you dropped that demand. Something else came on the table. And part of it was dropped because you didn't have a meaningful alliance with workers. You spoke on behalf of workers. And part of your the discourse is about these workers are our parents, they are mothers and our fathers, and they're African and they're black and they're poor. And so there's this sort of condescension of like, we speak on their behalf. We don't have to meaningfully engage in a life which says, what are your minimum conditions? And that's what, and we can talk about it, what we've attempted at Rhodes is to create a united front. Some of you might be familiar with the work, for example, Duncan Ellis, Marxist activist, who talks about the importance of united front tactic around the minimal program. He wrote about it in relation to the defense of the gains of the welfare state in mid-70s Britain leading up to Thatcher's Britain, and says that this is in the interest of both middle class and working people to defend universal public goods like the National Health Service and comprehensive education. So let's form a minimal platform and let's agree to disagree on tactics, but let's have the strategic objective in mind. And for us, the strategic objective is to increase funding in our education so we can provide a quality transformative education. So I think these are really big questions that are remaining unresolved, but we have, in some senses, been able to shift the agenda to form a stakeholder grouping, which are all unified around the idea that the state must increase funding to higher education. Let's take it up to 1% at least, which will put billions into the higher education system. And we're also saying that students, workers, administrators who have an interest in this demand, their future livelihoods, need to cohere around this as a strategic demand. So on the part of progressive scholars, there's a shift of the agenda towards the united front tactic. But the students are still suspicious about it because they see us as part of an historical narrative that has failed, the Mandela narrative, the post-94 narrative of the Rainbow Nation. And so there's this uneasiness of saying, so we hear you, but actually we're suspicious of actually you really fighting for your own sexual interest, although you accuse us of having sexual interest as students. So we're in this very interesting space, and the discourse doesn't allow us to engage, because the students' discourse is, the point of departure is largely around this fundamentalist discourse. And it's how can we get another kind of strategic discourse emerging, in the way that Nimi describes, like key writers from the African continent who write on education, but also other thinkers from other societies and other models, of which will be the most prominent, I think, in terms of transitional societies, are Nicaragua and the Sandinistas, and Cuba in the very early 1960s around the National Democracy Campaign. I can pick up more on that, but maybe just let's